Well, I think we'll begin to respect all of our times today. And as folks join us, they will join us. So welcome. Good afternoon. Thank you all for making time to join us here and hopefully for the larger endeavor that we begin today. My name is Matt Harper. I use he, him pronouns. I'm speaking to you from unceded Tongva Gabrieleño territory between their ancestral villages of Yamna and Apacheagna. I am part of the Los Angeles Catholic worker community and will be holding the role of facilitation today for the organizing team that has made this Reckoning with Our Mission Histories series possible. My familial and spiritual ancestors were settlers to this land, and I come today aware of the work that I have left to do. I offer these to situate myself in this work, to admit that these are the lenses I see this world and work through, and to support the larger work of acknowledging the tendencies of many to make assumptions of others and to define them through our lenses and systems. We know each of you come with your own histories and identities, and we are so grateful to have each of you as you
You
are,
did it. Thank you.
with all the richness you bring to this space. So we want to invite you to take a moment to notice your body and your breath. If it helps to close your eyes, please feel free to. Allow your mind to slow down and your attention to turn towards your inhales and your exhales. Engaging our past can sometimes become a hyper-intellectual activity. It can also bring up a lot of feelings in our bodies. As we go today, we invite you to come not just from your head, but also from your heart and the feeling parts of yourself. And we want to begin today with a prayer. And we recognize that folks pray in any number of ways. And since we may not all be of one faith, we recognize we pray to many different sources. So I will offer a spoken prayer from my tradition, but invite any to spend the next minute in a prayer that suits your practice and tradition. I begin in the name of the Creator and the Redeemer and the Spirit. Dear God, we know you by many names and experience you in so many different ways. As we gather, open our minds and hearts to your wisdom and insight. Guide our efforts and our actions to reflect the incarnate love you call us to. As we seek a path forward that reckons with the past, that uplifts often silenced voices, that pursues repair, may our work in some small way further your kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. Amen. Thank you. It's clear to us that land acknowledgements are insufficient offerings to those who've faced the never-ending violence of colonization. And we recognize one part of the processes of healing and repair is naming truths. So here in what we now call Los Angeles, we know that there are many tribes and bands, separate and interconnected communities who have been stewards of this earth, who have lived and prayed and loved and resisted and continue to do so today. We seek to honor the original peoples of the land many of us are on, the Gabrieleño Tongva, the Kich, the Fernandeño Tataviam, and the Ventureño Chumash, and their ancestors past, present, and emerging. And more than just recognizing, we are here today to begin to take responsibility for the history of our spiritual ancestors. We commit to helping Catholics and others to build and deepen our understanding, to sharpen our analyses of our histories, to grow our capacity to have difficult conversations, and to take our responsibility for the part of the work that is ours to hold. For those who are outside the Los Angeles area, we invite you later to learn about the original and continued caretakers of the land that you reside on. But more than just whose land it is, we invite you to take some time to learn about their stories. As we begin today and continue in the future, it's important that we consider how we move and the spirit with which we enter and engage these conversations. To reckon with anything requires a willingness to listen, to reflect, and to engage with care. Are we open to discomforting ideas and realizations? Are we open to being changed? Will we listen before preparing to respond? Will we welcome multiple viewpoints? Will we make space so that often ignored voices can be heard? Will we lean into discomfort? Will we move with care? And will we acknowledge our biases and socializations, our fears, and our ego? Now, it's important for you all to understand what you have stepped into this afternoon. And then after this, we'll get into our presentation. Where did this project come from? Why isn't this session being facilitated by Native elders? And where do we go from here? 250 years ago, despite immediate resistance by Native people, Franciscan missionaries founded the San Gabriel Mission in what we now call Los Angeles County. In June 2021, the Archbishop of Los Angeles proclaimed a Jubilee year for our Roman Catholic community to celebrate this anniversary with a commitment not to look at the past, but to move forward in mission. To many, this felt insufficient. Too many pieces of our mission system legacy cannot responsibly fit into the commitment simply for celebration and commemoration. But more than just insufficient, it felt incongruous. Archbishop Gomez previously admitted that we cannot learn history's lessons or heal old wounds unless we understand what really happened, how it happened, and why. What could have been the perfect moment to invite collective engagement and accountability has instead become a continued deflection of our responsibility to reckon with the past. Following the personalist call of Scripture, the invitation not to wait for someone else to do what needs to be done, a small group of concerned faithful came together to help build a space for what we felt had been missed and to invite our church to join with us. Thank you for showing up and hearing that invitation. Let us be clear, this effort requires relationship and accountability with Native communities directly impacted by our mission system. And those communities will be driving forces in determining where we go and how we get there. But with so many other responsibilities and labors required of them, it is not on those communities to do the initial work of preparing our hearts, opening our minds, and building our capacity to have these conversations. We take responsibility to prepare our people, to earn the trust of Native communities, to build genuine relationships that will offer something fruitful for all. Over the next 6 months, we'll offer monthly sessions that invite us to hear, to reflect, and to grow our understandings of the California mission system. We will hear today from Elaine Enns and Ched Myers, two non-Native people who have been doing crucial and accountable work in their settler communities that will prepare us to show up with greater integrity as we transition to hearing from Native elders, researchers, and theologians whose voices must be centered as we continue our work. Over that time, we'll continue to build relationships with our local Native communities so that for the remainder of this Jubilee year and beyond, we can move into accountable, responsible, and authentic action. We hope you will join us. Colonialism has not ended. I have not done enough reckoning with my ancestral history as a settler on Indigenous land. And yet we are all being invited by Native communities into considering how we can be good guests on others' lands. In a moment, we'll hear from Ched and Elaine, who model for many how non-Native people of faith can be proactive in taking responsibility for their ancestral legacies. They're individuals who model a love that throws no one away, but who also speaks hard truths of love, that invites self and others into transformation, and that honors the wisdom of those with lived experience. They show how non-Native people can do work responsibly and accountably with Native communities. Their recent book, Healing Haunted Histories, A Settler Discipleship of Decolonization, is a profound gift and guide to any of us of faith seeking to reckon with our histories of colonization. I want to thank them in advance for the gift of their wisdom and labor and love to this project. And so without further ado, would love to introduce Ched Myers and Elaine Enns from the Bartimaeus Cooperative Ministries.
Oh, thank you, Matt. We are so grateful for our long friendship with folks at the Los Angeles Catholic Worker community. And we are really excited, Matt, for your acquisition of this space and to all of you who are tuning in this afternoon. We are happy to partner with you in helping launch this educational series of this important campaign around, and I'll say again, the 250th anniversary of the San Gabriel mission. We share deeply your concerns about how to heal the haunted histories of colonization. And today we'll work from our book that Matt mentioned, published earlier this year, that is on this subject. Ched and I are beaming into you from the little town of Oakview, halfway up the Ventura River watershed in the Southern California bioregion. This is the heart of traditional unceded and untreated Chumash territory, where colonization began in earnest in 1782 with the establishment of Mission San Buenaventura, the 9th of the 21 Franciscan missions. Ched and I are settlers here and are responsible to this legacy. And we understand our Christian discipleship to be the work of healing wounds in our place and people in order to more deeply realize God's vision of beloved community here. So we welcome each of you to this campaign's challenging work of revision and revisioning, which is to say, taking another deeper look at and then decolonizing the mission's history and legacy here in California. Revision as reconsideration requires a critical approach to how we narrate our collective story in this place, but also a compassionate one, mindful that this is surgery on living flesh. Revisioning recognizes that the received narratives about our settler colonial history represent a fabric woven from many strands of half-truth and self-justifying mythology that has disappeared the truths of Indigenous life. What has been devised must be revised so that healing can take place for both those who have been marginalized and those of us who have been advantaged by this history and ongoing legacy.
We want to note at the outset that today is the last Sunday in the liturgical season of Pentecost Ordinary Time. Next week begins the Christian New Year, the first Sunday in Advent. So it's a good time to ponder great turnings. Today is traditionally celebrated as Reign of Christ Sunday, and the gospel reading today is John's portrait of Jesus before Pilate. Here, Jesus testifies that his sovereignty must not be equated with that of the empires of the world, which is why his followers are not supposed to fight. This is a poignant note on which to commence our reconsideration of how Christian missionaries came here to indigenous lands armed with swords and guns to establish European hegemony. So let's begin by reconsidering the roots of our Christian tradition of evangelization in the gospel itself. Jesus' so-called missionary instructions appear in all three synoptic gospels. This passage surely haunts the consciousness of Christendom the world over, because had Christians observed these simple guidelines for how to interact with other peoples and places, the history of the world would be profoundly different. Jesus could not have been clearer or more unequivocal in these marching orders, but for the most part, our ancestors in the faith ignored them. And consequently, there's been hell to pay, a legacy of domination and supremacy and genocide that reaches across centuries and into every corner of the globe. Here's our text again, arranged in its chiastic structure, A, B, C, B, A. This composition functions to emphasize verse 4 at the center, as you can see, the command to respect one's host by living within the limits of their capacity for and willingness to extend hospitality, which is exactly what our missionary ancestors did not do here on Turtle Island for the most part. It represents the road not taken. Jesus' instructions to his movement were simple, clear, and timeless. How different history would have been had we heeded them. Let's look more closely at the salient points of this instruction. Note that Jesus' commission to his movement organizers is twofold: to proclaim an alternative socio-political order called the Kingdom of God, and to confront unclean spirits and cure diseases. This last aspect is reiterated in verse 2 as healing the weak, a noun which in Greek connotes both physical and socioeconomic vulnerability. These goals are repeated in the concluding part of this passage, a framing technique. So verse 6 defines the proclamation as good news, a phrase the early Christian movement appropriated from Roman propaganda and then turned upside down. Good news, not for the powerful, but for the poor. From the Greek verb evangelizo, we get the term evangelization. There's nothing objectionable about a movement that seeks to organize for liberation and wholeness. Indeed, every human social order contains elements of both oppression and illness. This brings us to the critical matter of how organizers show up. The significance of verse 3 cannot be overstated. Don't carry your baggage into a host community, warns Jesus. This isn't about just traveling light, it's about going vulnerably. No staff and bag means the traveling organizers are liminal, dependent, not in control. Jesus' strategy here contrasts starkly with the old story of 1 Samuel 17, who you'll remember approached the foreigner Goliath with a staff and a bag full of 5 stones. In other words, to do battle. Tragically, too often over the last 500 years, missionary baggage was weaponized because the ultimate colonizing intent was not to heal, but to conquer and to dominate. The instruction to forsake bread and money is pretty straightforward. These are the means of sustenance on the road. Not to be self-sufficient guarantees the dependence of the organizer upon those that he or she is approaching. This ensures that the host, not the guest, retains the upper hand. The instruction to limit oneself is interesting, given that a change of clothes would have been a rare luxury among peasant Middle Easterners. Moreover, it stands to reason that if organizers don't have extra tunics, they'll eventually have to adopt the clothing of their hosts when in a cross-cultural situation. Because costuming matters. It is a way of either fitting in or remaining apart. The history of the colonial era suggests that Christian missionaries got this bass-ackward. Not only did they bring trunks full of their own culture and presuppositions and clothes, but they demanded that their baggage, including their costumes, be imposed on their native hosts. How different things would have been had Christians practiced a disrobed gospel, naked and unashamed, so to speak. Here we arrive at the center of Jesus' teaching, the instruction to remain in a home that welcomes you. The implication is that organizers must stay long enough to build relationships and to truly understand the new place and people, which can take a very long time. Again, this is a hedge on the temptation to impose. Of course, this requires that there is a local host who is willing to provide hospitality, so organizers had better be on good behavior and make themselves useful. This instruction is reiterated later in Luke 10 and expanded. Don't move from house to house, served, and leave only a blessing of peace on those who welcome you. In other words, don't look for a better deal, don't demand special treatment, eat local, be grateful. The implication is that the missionary remains a guest without a settlement footprint that takes over. Remain with your hosts, says Jesus, and then at some point, leave. And there's the key. An important early definition of settler colonialism, sociologist Patrick Wolf writes, is that it strives for the dissolution of native societies. It erects a new colonial society on the expropriated land base. Settler colonizers come to stay. Which brings to mind the famous lament of the colonized, attributed to Jomo Kenyatta, although often quoted by Desmond Tutu and others. What we were supposed to do, according to Jesus, was to offer the gift of healing and good news and move on, lingering only on the terms of the host. How different history would have been. The final core instruction is that interesting ritual of what to do as an emissary of the movement if you are not welcomed. This is included because it is always and everywhere a real prospect. In that case, says Jesus, move on. Don't retaliate. Don't force yourself on your hosts. Don't condemn them to hell. And don't take over their frickin' house. The shaking off of dust is clearly a symbolic gesture that is important to Luke. It's a form of nonviolent protest, noted again in chapter 10, which Jesus associates with the rejection of the angelic travelers in the ancient story of Sodom, whose sin, contrary to how most Christians understand that old tale, was the lack of hospitality. So Jesus is saying, yes, inhospitality is a serious problem, especially for vulnerable movement envoys. But all you can do is point it out. If folks don't have ears to hear good news, keep walking. Done and dusted, so to speak.
Thank you for this.
How different things would have been if these straightforward instructions would have guided Christian missions.
But history is what did happen, not what should have happened. Christian missions have a long and complex history, and the spread of Christianity across time, 2 millennia, and space, the entire globe, and cultures, almost none untouched, hasn't always and everywhere been synonymous with conquest and colonization. If we assume a simple story, we miss the amazing episodes in which the gospel did spread organically and peaceably, and often not by white folk. But it is equally important to acknowledge the much harder fact that all too often and all too ubiquitously, Christian missions have fused cross and sword, conversion and conquest, evangelization and subjugation. Because of this apostasy, the history of contact, especially between Indigenous and European immigrants in the Americas, is laced with settler betrayal and violation. Let us simply recognize 3 major watershed moments using a very broad brush in the church's slow but steady transformation of Jesus' cross into an imperial sword. The first was agreeing to become the official religion of empire under Constantine in the 4th century. Under the new conditions of Christendom, missionization began to become fused with political conquest or control throughout the Mediterranean world and then into Europe. The second watershed were the Crusades of the first 3 centuries of the 2nd millennium. These wars laid the groundwork for the church's explicit and militant blessing of the conquest of foreign lands and peoples. And then the third were the doctrines of discovery, issued by various popes in the 15th and 16th centuries, which explicitly authorized missionization in terms of genocide, and thus legitimated the so-called age of conquest. And it is worth refreshing our memories here. The first pronunciamento stated that Christian explorers had the right and duty to invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all pagans whatsoever, wheresoever placed, and the kingdoms, possessions, and all movable and immovable goods whatsoever held and possessed by them, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, and to apply and appropriate to himself and his successors the possessions and goods, and to convert them to his and their use and profit. These ecclesial and later legal doctrines continue to justify the long and bitter history of European entitlement to other people's lands and resources around the world, as a recent film by Indigenous historian Steve Newcomb outlines. This is a legacy our churches have yet to fully reckon with. This new era saw Spain claim over the course of mere decades most of Latin America, including what is today called California, despite the fact that until the late 18th century, it was understood as an island, as shown in this old map. And as you know, the keystone strategy for Spain's colonization of California was a system of 21 missions, each about a day's ride apart. Mission San Gabriel was the fourth of the missions, and it was established in 1771. We won't go into this history, as you have plenty of opportunity to explore it in the months to come. But for now, we'll just let the summary of our friend Chumash Ohlone sociologist Jonathan Cordero suffice. Almost 80% in the missions died in the missions. They lost their language, their culture, their communities, their land, and they became subjugated at the bottom rung of society. It is important to note that the colonization of California native peoples did not happen without resistance. This is a beautiful mural in East Los Angeles of the Tongva medicine woman Toy Perina, who in 1785 organized a rebellion against Mission San Gabriel, which, though unsuccessful, remains an important legacy of resistance. In 1821, Mexico became independent from Spain. A major impact on the remote colony of California was the secularization of the missions through the 1830s, which further disenfranchised the remnant indigenous population. The following decade, the Mexican-American War paved the way for the American occupation of the American Southwest, sealed in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. Within months, we might note, after gold was discovered in California. However disenfranchising the Spanish and Mexican colonization of California was, the American period brought nothing less than genocide, as UCLA historian Benjamin Madley has recently chronicled in detail.
Over the next century, the population of Southern California doubled in size every 10 years, thanks to a flood of in-migration by white Easterners. It began with the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869. Perhaps you've seen this famous image before. It was actually originally a railroad poster that sought to assure Eastern Americans that it was now safe to settle in the Wild West. But it is a text worth exegeting, because in it, the medieval theological doctrines of discovery morph into a thoroughly secular ideology of progress as manifest destiny. It celebrates the inexorable march of white domination over the continent. Notice in the foreground, this is led by militia and followed closely by resource extractors, and then farmers, and then locomotives, a fairly accurate summary of 19th century colonization. The sun rises behind the Mississippi River, while indigenous peoples, together with buffalo and bear, flee into the darkness. That's not an angel in the middle, but the mythic image of Columbia, a feminized version of Columbus, the personification of America. She lays telegraph wire with her left hand, but that's not the Bible in her right. It's a school book. Tragically, most North American churches, Catholic and Protestant alike, were thoroughly seduced by the mythology of empire, as celebrated in yet another piece of propagandizing art from the same era. This one hangs in the US Capitol. This is why Christians ignored or rationalized away the clear instructions Jesus gave to his followers about how to build their movement that we looked at just a few minutes ago. Because the perverted gospel of colonization was and is predicated upon a thorough colonization of the gospel. So here's the deal. This campaign that Matt is talking about, it's not just about missions history, nor is it about trying to exonerate ourselves by disassociating from the Catholic legacy. Because the truth is, every single one of us settlers followed the logic and the momentum that was opened up by those first missionaries and explorers. We are settlers and resettlers in California. I'll just use my story as an example. I'm a fifth generation Californian. My dad's maternal side were all Californians, Mexican Californians, a patrimony that both delights and haunts me. My great-great-grandfather, Francisco Mendoza, was pushed to Turtle Island by the tide of European revolutions in 1848, escaping from Portugal to Mexico and then coming north to Sonora, California, so named because Mexican gold miners were congregated and segregated there. Mendoza married Inés Núñez, who was born in Mexico in 1829. They settled there in Sonora, which was and is Miwok territory. Their second daughter, Maria Rosario, married Luis Guerena, a saloon keeper. Their daughter, Inés Belle, was my grandmother. She married a German American who was a tire salesman whose father had worked his way west with the railroads. They were all devout Catholics until my dad left the church as an adult, possibly a victim of clergy abuse. The hard times of the Great Depression pulled my dad's family from the foothills of Sonora to urban San Francisco, Ohlone territory. He shared a room with his abuela Maria, who still spoke mostly Spanish. Having grown up poor, my dad assimilated as much as he could so he could realize the American dream. And not having a Hispanic surname helped. And he did make it, surviving World War II and the Korean War, then resettling in Los Angeles in the 1950s, Tongva territory. See, these resettlements, like those of your families, followed the colonial pattern of entitlement to inhabit any place. My dad eventually became a successful businessman, though at the price of exiling his Mexican side. Because for all immigrant communities in America, the process of assimilation into the dominant culture was or is a constant negotiation of loss. I carry all of this in my bones, and so do you. When I was a teenager, my family used to camp along the Gaviota Coast, northwest of Santa Barbara, where it was and remains one of the last remnants of undeveloped coastal sage chaparral in Southern California. This was and is the heart of Chumash country. We often camped in Tahiguas Canyon, the former site I learned later of the Chumash village of Tahiwa. One year, my dad called our attention to an old coast live oak not far from our campsite. It was adorned with this arbor glyph dating to the early 1800s and thought to be a Chumash rendering of a neophyte, that is, someone forcibly taken into the Spanish mission system, kneeling before a Franciscan padre. This was my first exposure as an already alienated teenager growing up in an unchurched home, the height of the Vietnam War, to the heavy footprint of the Spanish colonization of California. Although at the time, We just called it the Indian tree, with no further context or conversation. Only later did I awaken to the real stories this land holds, as recently outlined by Indigenous Californian scholar Elias Castillo. But this fading photo of that tattooed tree has hung on my wall for decades, like a haunting, a continuing reminder of the need for us Christians to face the legacy of colonizing missions in this place.
Sociologist Avery Gordon has been studying haunting as a social phenomenon. In her important book, Ghostly Matters, she asserts that haunting is a constituent element of modern social life through which repressed or unresolved social violence makes itself known in everyday life, especially when they are supposedly over and done with, slavery, for instance, or when their oppressive nature is continuously denied. Gordon also emphasizes how reckoning with these ghosts can mobilize individual, social, or political movements, but only if they are faced. And that is exactly what this campaign is inviting us to do regarding the mission's legacy. Not just decolonizing memory, but reconsidering our own identity and decolonizing our own individual and collective discipleship as church. Jim Bear Jacobs, a native Mohican colleague in Minneapolis, points out that Westerners or Western culture tends to steward its narratives through texts, while Indigenous cultures understand their stories to be embedded in the land itself. The challenge for us today, he says, is to learn the stories the land holds. Beneath the surface soil or built environment of every place are strata of story and culture with which we as settlers must come to terms. To review, Californian history has several distinct strata, like this coastal California cliffside, which correlate to the pre-contact era of Indigenous sovereignty, on top of which are strata of 3 successive waves of white conquest and colonization: Spanish, then Mexican, then American. And not to mention the last layer of 130 years of industrial development and paving over of the native story. In reality, however, these strata are more like the tortured bends and twists shown in this image of the famous San Andreas Fault. This is a poignant metaphor for the tectonic forces of trauma that have twisted Indigenous lives. It is on this tortured land that we settlers also live, and we are inheritors of the Christian tradition in this place. It is ours to face. Contemporary Indigenous activist Nikki Sanchez puts the matter succinctly. The history of settler colonialism is not your fault, but it is absolutely your responsibility. The LA Catholic Workers Campaign is about nurturing an ability to respond to the stories the land holds, to be accountable rather than dissociative, engaged rather than agnostic or the denial of willful unknowing, and to do the work of healing hauntings. Mission San Gabriel is the focus of this campaign because the Archdiocese wants to raise up that legacy. It still sits on unceded Tongva territory. In 1852, the new state of California made 18 treaties, which recognized, among others, the Tongva. But these treaties were never adopted by the federal government. Although they were finally recognized by the state in 1994, the Tongva are still landless and federally unrecognized. Yet despite all odds, the Tongva are still here, and they are revisioning a future. And so are we. This campaign is about animating and empowering personal and political practices of what we call in our book, Restorative Solidarity, which invites us into 3 core commitments. First is to do our own work as settlers, immigrant settlers, descendants, around issues like ethnic loss and assimilation, white fragility, and the impact of intergenerational trauma and moral injury, in order to understand our own deformation by and entanglement in the legacy and structures of settler colonialism. 2, to listen how Indigenous and other communities victimized by historic and current injustices are telling their stories and identifying harms, needs, and responsibilities. And 3, to work with these communities to, quote, make things as right as possible. And this includes covenants of accountability, restitution, reparations, repatriation, and perhaps over time, even reconciliation. Now, this process is an ongoing circle, a life work, and ultimately it must lead to concrete expressions of redistributive justice.
So we're going to leave you with some queries to kick off your debriefs. And they're also going to be dropped in the chat. We won't go over these now. We'll let Matt go over those with you. But this hopefully will help spark some conversation. We are very grateful, Matt, and everyone who showed up today for yet another Zoom program, for your time and attention. And Matt is going to place you into discussion groups. If you want to go deeper into some of these issues, we do recommend Healing Haunted Histories as a study guide. You can go to the site mentioned here to get a 40% discount. And y'all are warmly invited to join us online at our 2022 Institute in February, which will continue conversations on these topics. We're so grateful for the chance to be in your circle. And we just want to leave this by revisiting the image from the opening slide. This is the only mission period painting on canvas attributed to a Native artist, still on display at Mission Santa Ynez. St. Raphael holds close to his body. He has Indigenous features. Perhaps this spectacular image can fire our imaginations for how Indigenous vision and tradition can help us revision and decolonize our Christian tradition. Our benediction comes from the great Maya Angelou's inaugural poem, now 30 years old. History, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again. Thanks, Matt.
Thank you so much, Ched and Elaine. So much to reflect on and chew on. We invite folks to really see what stuck with them and to dive into that. We're about to go into breakout rooms of about 5 or 6 people for 30 minutes. And we invite you to share that space in a way that gives access to everyone's voice, so that no one is left out of this time to chat, to process, to work through this. I'm going to be dropping the questions in a moment and invite you to pick the ones that really stand up, to feel like they are on top for you. You won't have time to engage them all, but dive in as you feel willing to push yourself. At the end, we will be doing some sharebacks in the chat. So I invite you to think about what items from the conversation stand out to you. What are some of the takeaways you want to share with others so that we can all share them together after we come back together. So I'm dropping into the chat our questions. The first is, can you name one of your ancestral lines? Where did they come from? How and when did you or your ancestors come to California, and where did they settle? And then who are the Indigenous peoples, past and present, of where you currently live? Do you have relationships with them? Where did you learn, or what did you learn about Native Californians in school? Have you visited a mission or a renteria or reserve? Can you identify a haunting on the landscape of where you currently reside? What can you do to learn more about that unresolved story and work towards healing and justice? And finally, given the recognition that this is considered a jubilee year by the Catholic Church, what might aspects of an alternative jubilee year commemoration be that would affirm a full, genuine release? So again, invite you to think about anything that came up for you that you'd like to share about, or any of these questions, and we'll see you back here in 30 minutes. Thank you so much, and talk to you soon. Beautiful. Thank you all so much for coming back. Sorry for any groups that were small. A couple of folks left us right before the breakouts. So anyone who is in an intimate group, I hope it was a fruitful conversation. Just wanted to take a couple minutes and start off with the chat. In the chat, if anyone had any thoughts, ideas, reflections that came up, wanting to create space there, we will share out loud a couple of thoughts as well, but knowing that we only have about 8 minutes left and we want to respect your time, would love to capture any ideas, takeaways, next steps there, and then we'll have a conversation. I see your hand, Bobby, and we'll definitely, is it a clarifying question? You're muted at the moment. You're muted, Bobby. Yeah.
At the end of it, very end of our conversation, I was bringing up that I was wondering if Chad or sorry, what I can't remember, Elaine can comment on this, that the ethnographers in the past did a great undercount of how many Indigenous people, the population of Indigenous people in North America, compared to what is being discussed now. I don't know if they know anything about that, but so the actual loss of Indigenous people was much greater than we were led to believe.
And we're going to get, our next session is going to dive into some of the specific.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
No, you're fine. Appreciate it. But right now, just want to take a moment before we share back in this large space. Invite folks to continue to throw things in the chat, maybe some takeaways. And then we'll have a chance just briefly to share some more thoughts. That way we capture all of the brilliance and the insights that came out in small groups, and then we'll share this with everyone. So I'm seeing things about rewriting an icon of Junipero to be St. Francis. This complexity about, maybe we haven't all had formal education on Indigenous communities, but so eagerness to learn more, some of what you were saying, Bobby, some of the details and the facts. This encouragement around biblical perspectives on Jubilee. What does Jubilee mean, and are we doing that integrously? Truth and Reconciliation Committee in Los Angeles, the possibilities of what that could look like. See, many said the church should invite Indigenous voices into churches to speak and share stories. There's a great silence, at least within the Catholic world, about the Indigenous past. Spaces for reconciliation and healing. So this recognition too that words are powerful, and referring to Saint Junipero Serra as Saint Sarah, and indicating that he is elevated and recognized as elevated. So an encouragement to think about the words that are used. Any other thoughts, takeaways that feel like fruitful things to chew on? Healing circles, public apology, celebration, inviting Indigenous people to share their culture, tell their stories, humanizing the reality of their lives. Yeah, Chad. Oh, you're muted.
One thing that occurred to me just later is that the Universal Catholic Church has this wonderful process coming up called the Synod. And what an opportunity that would be for us to hear Indigenous voices, not only from the United States, but from around the world. But at this moment, I don't see the Archdiocese engaging too much in that process, at least not in where we are. But that would be a tremendous opportunity to hear Indigenous voices in that sort of setting.
Definitely. Thank you. So got time for about one more share. If anyone would like to, recognizing there's more in the chat that, again, I'll share back with everyone afterwards, so it won't be lost. Maybe visiting literal missions, maybe space at each missions to tell a more full truth, like they're trying to do up at Santa Clara right now, and the story of Junipero Serra and the missions.
One thing, if I might suggest, is that I'm in education. I teach high school, and I think looking at what elementary schools do in terms of mission education and what high school curriculums, whether they include Indigenous history or whether it's not even mentioned or how it's mentioned, because even in U.S. history books, Native peoples can be relegated to just a page or a paragraph. So I think educationally, to prepare the future generations, that's a huge thing that might require more systematic approach. But I think that's an element that needs to be brought to the forefront.
Thank you. Rosa, go ahead.
Going back to words, I think we have to learn how to listen, and what our attitudes are. Are we being just like the missionaries, where we're demanding of Native American people to teach us instead of looking out? And how do we use words? I think of our African American brothers and sisters when I hear the word mission, because for them, the word plantation, of course, is a slave word. It's a horrible word. It has nothing of glamour or romance. Certainly not a place to go and take children to learn about the glamour of the South or to have wedding receptions and the rest. I wonder if that's the same way our Native American brothers and sisters feel about the missions. The word mission. My two daughters went to San Gabriel Mission High School. Their mascot is Pioneer. How does that fall? I think we need to start looking at words and learning how are we going to listen.
Thank you, Rosa. That's really important. And I want to name that this space, because I think one of the things you mentioned, Rosa, was putting labor on our Indigenous brothers and sisters. And one of the things we need to do is listen deeply to what is needed from us. And the other thing is to make offerings around how we can be of support and use. And we're not at that stage yet. There's a lot more listening to do, a lot more learning to do, a lot more preparing ourselves to do. And in that vein, our next session does not have a date yet, but we promise to update you soon. But in that session, we will be diving into some of the specific histories that are not often centered in Catholic narratives around this system we're talking about. We'll get to hear some of the stories and facts and details, and hopefully beyond just academic and intellectual thoughts, but the stories and the truths that must be heard. We also recognize coming this week is a national holiday that the United States celebrates. And while it is important to be thankful and to spend time with loved ones, we also invite folks to think about the complexity of this specific holiday and what that might mean in your experiences with friends and family. We'll send out some resources for those interested in finding ways to start conversations in your communities around this holiday and around this notion of Indigenous justice and